Hey everybody, welcome to 6 Mile Cypress Slough and Preserve here in Fort Myers. And when we're doing this field trip, one of the things that often gets overlooked at this park is the parking lot. And so a couple of things that I like to point out in the parking lot. So we talk about this term impervious surface. And so when we have areas of blacktop, concrete, sidewalks, buildings, driveways, houses, those are all impervious surfaces where water can no longer percolate down into the ground. And so if we think about all the construction and development in Southwest Florida, we're creating a lot of impervious surface. And when it rains, that water needs to go somewhere. So dealing with water as a result of impervious surfaces is something that we have to deal with here in Southwest Florida. And this is why our wetlands are particularly important, because our wetlands act like big sponges. And so one of the things that this area does is, again, it acts as a big sponge. So if you're familiar with the area surrounding this park, there's a couple of big shopping plazas to the north, there's shopping plazas to the south. And so this area acts as a big sponge, and so all the water from those areas will drain into this wetland. Instead of naturally going down into the ground, this wetland will absorb that water and it will release it at a slower rate into our downstream ecosystems. The other thing that it does, it actually filters the pollutants out of the water, and again, the water is going to be cleaner once it leaves this ecosystem. Some other things to notice in the parking lot, right? So we have some hardwood trees and we have some pine trees here. And so again, on this field trip, one of the things I like to point out, and if you're following along with the photo scavenger hunt on the field trip worksheet and you're looking for evidence of pine flatwoods or hardwood hammock ecosystems, don't forget to check out the parking lot. If you're here at a time that the interpretive center is open, I also encourage you to go check out the interpretive center and see what they have going on up there. You'll also find out some more information. All right, so we're gonna head over to the boardwalk, and one of the things I always encourage my students to do when we come to this park is make sure you keep your distance from people, not just for social distancing reasons, but just be respectful. A lot of people are here looking at wildlife, and so when you're here, you shouldn't be talking above a whisper, and you shouldn't be yelling, you shouldn't be spread out. So I ask that if you come to this park, make sure you're courteous and respectful to the other guests of the park. So if you remember the term ecotone from our other field trips, right? If we notice, right, we've got our palmettos, some oaks, some wax myrtles and things like that growing right here. And then pretty quickly we have a drop in elevation. And then this leads us into our cypress ecosystem. And again, if you come here at different times of year, you will notice that the cypress trees will be void of leaves in the winter months, and oftentimes in the winter months this area will be dry down here. So those are some of the things that you'll notice different times of the year. So you'll notice a change in the water level, and also, right, these cypress trees will actually lose their leaves in the winter time, and those leaves will fall down into the water here and they'll sink to the bottom. So again, just one more reminder, if you are coming to this park, make sure you are following the rules. No pets, no cell phones, make sure you're being respectful. As we're walking along here, I'm doing my best to kind of avoid other people and not talk over groups. So if I randomly turn the camera off in some spots, that's what's going on. So as you come out here to this large body of water, a couple of things to look for. On these platforms, there's usually some birds or alligators hanging around. But I also encourage you to kind of look over the edge here, because occasionally you'll see an alligator hang out in these weeds. So some different spots to take a look at. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about in our wetland ecosystems is the idea of wetland delineation. And that's how to determine if an area is a wetland or not. And so obviously this is a standing body of water. There's water here year round. And so when we think about the hydro period of this area is that there is water in it year round. But some areas, again, the water does rise and fall. So if you've been here different times of the year, right, we are into the beginning of the wet season here. So there is standing water, but there are other times of the year where a lot of this park is dry, aside from this large body of water here. Another thing we could look at to determine if an area is a wetland or not is wetland plants. And so if you see, any type of these lilies, the American white water lily is very common here in Florida, but if you see any type of these lilies, they will only grow in a wetland ecosystem. And so sometimes, like we said, wetlands do dry out. And if you see plants like these lilies and they're on the ground in sort of a dried up mud, well, we know that that area must be a wetland because it has to be wet for a good portion of the year for these things to grow. All right, well, let's continue on down the trail. So one of the things I want to point out in this area, and so we're actually, if you're following along on the trail guide, I should have talked about that at the beginning. We are at Station 6, and so I'll try and point those out as we walk along. But this is kind of a transition area. So right here behind me, right, so that large lake was in that direction. But if we look behind me, we've got, we do have some cypress trees, but we also have some pine and oak here. And so this is a slightly higher ecosystem area here. And so as we're walking down the trail this way, the elevation is declining just a couple of inches. And you can see right here, right, it's still somewhat dry. It's a little bit muddy, but still somewhat dry. And as we continue on down this boardwalk, this will eventually just fill up with water as we go lower and lower in elevation as we head down this way. So as we walk along this section of the boardwalk, a couple of neat things to look for, especially in the weeds and the grass right here. Look for areas where the grass is kind of beaten down. It almost kind of looks like an animal has continually walked through that way, and it will continue onto the boardwalk and in this direction. And so oftentimes you'll have alligators will come under this boardwalk, and there's usually one that hangs around along the edge right here, so keep an eye out for it. So we'll just take a quick mention on the tour guide here. So number 7 on the trail guide is actually pointing out this slash pine tree right here. And so we did see some slash pines on our campus field trip, and they're very common here in Southwest Florida. This one is a bit older. You can see that, right? Remember we talked about fire ecology. They expend as much energy as they can when they're younger to grow tall before they have branches. They want to get those branches above the fire line. So this one here, again, this ecosystem does not typically burn because it is a forested wetland, but their branches are, about 15 or 20 feet in the air before there's actually any branches off of the main trunk of the tree. And so one of the things we talked about too is that these pine trees, they will continuously drop pine needles year round. But unlike the cypress trees, the pine trees are, they keep their needles year round, so they're just continuously growing them and dropping them. Whereas the cypress trees, they will grow their leaves in the spring and summer months, and they will fall off in the fall. All right, I'm at station number 8 along the trail stop here. This is actually a nice viewing platform for alligators here. I don't see any out today. But a field trip pro tip here is if you come here and you lean over the edge to look down in the water, make sure you hang on to your sunglasses if you've got them on your head or tucked into your shirt. I've had a lot of students lose sunglasses right here. So just a pro tip for hanging onto your sunglasses. Also, when you're coming through here and you are working on the field trip scavenger hunt, make sure you're reading the signs and looking at the brochure for the park. If they don't have any paper brochures out, go ahead and use the your cell phone. They have a QR code and you can scan a digital copy. And if you're following along the trail signs, it'll actually let you know what you're looking at. So again, as here's a, I don't know if you can see him in there, but there's a wading bird in there. But anyways, as we transition to a slightly lower elevation, you'll notice, right, less and less of the oaks and the pines, more of the cypress, and also more water on the ground here. So one of the things you will notice here is the water also, again, has that iced tea color. So if you watched the last video and we were in our Cypress Dome on campus, the water had that iced tea color. And we said that was from the tannic acid in the water. And so, again, what's continuously happening is these trees are dropping leaf litter. The water will flow over that leaf litter. And as those leaves decay, they release tannins, right? Which is kind of like iced tea. So again, if you make a glass of tea, right, you put a tea bag in the water, and what is that tea bag filled with, right? Decaying, or not decaying, but just dried up plant leaves, and they stay in that water, the iced tea color. So when this water is this color like iced tea, it's not dirty, it's just stained with tannic acid. And so the water is slightly acidic. All right, we're at number 9 on our trail stop guide here. And so they call this area the wood duck pond. So this is actually a natural pond. So depressions like this exist in our wetlands. And one of the benefits of having a depression like this in the wetland is during the dry season, the water will persist in this area. And so that actually gives a refuge for different fish and frogs and things like that that actually need the water, that live in this ecosystem. They have a refuge so the wetland does not totally dry out, and so they have that to go to. The trail guide lists this pond as a flag pond because of the persistence of a plant called alligator flag, and I don't actually see any growing in here right now. But the species is called alligator flag because if there was to be an alligator in the water and it was moving through the alligator flag, it would actually wave because the alligator was moving the plant. And so that's that's why it's named alligator flag. Again, I don't see any alligators out here today, but there is a log right out there, a very common place for alligators to hang out on. I'm kind of here at a weird time during the day. I'm here, it's about 10:30 in the morning, but if you come early in the morning or a little bit later in the evening, you'll definitely see more wildlife than I'm seeing because I came sort of in the middle or the heat of the day, so a lot of things are just kind of hunkered down right now. So we're at Station 10 in our trail stop here, and the thing that Station 10 likes to point out is this very large cypress tree in the back here. The park has nicknamed it the grandmother tree. It is an old growth cypress tree. Many of the other cypress trees that you see in this park, and if you watch the FGCU campus ecosystem video, those are second growth trees, which means that at one point in time they were harvested and cut down and they've regrown. So a lot of the trees in Southwest Florida, and actually much of Florida, have been cut down at one point or another and have regrown in the last 75 to 100 years. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. We don't have a lot of original growth trees left here in Florida. Most of our trees have been harvested and have since regrown. But this one here, this is an old growth cypress tree. And again, if you ever go to Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, it's a little bit further south. If you visit Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and you see the cypress trees there and you compare them in size to the cypress trees here, they're actually much larger. Those are old growth cypress trees, where many of these are secondary growth, which means they've been cut down and harvested and have since regrown. So another thing you'll notice on some of these trees is we have a variety of different types of lichens. If we're looking at our campus video before we watch this one, we showed some of the blood lichen in our campus ecosystem video, but we do have some lichen on the trees here. And so if you are unfamiliar with what lichen is, lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. So a plant and an algae, or the plant is the algae, and then the fungus. And so what's happening in this symbiotic relationship, and so if we're talking about types of symbiosis, it's mutualism, because they're both benefiting each other. So again, here's some more lichen. But the plant is functioning as a plant, so it's taking in carbon dioxide and water through photosynthesis, and it is giving off oxygen and creating glucose, and so that glucose is then feeding the algae. And the algae, on the other hand, is actually breaking down whatever it's growing on and turning that into usable nutrients that the plant can take up. Right? And so the plants are taking those nutrients in, and they're getting the nutrients that they need to grow, and the algae is getting the glucose from the plant that it needs. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So it's actually two species actually kind of functioning as a single species. So if you look at my PowerPoint slides on wetlands, one of the things it categorizes the different types of wetlands. And one way to categorize wetlands is based on vegetation growth. And so 3 of those categories are marsh, shrub bog, and a swamp. And I imagine most of you probably just use the term swamp for any kind of wet area. But a swamp is actually a forested wetland. So we are actually, 6 Mile Cypress is a swamp, because this area is forested. We do have a lot of trees growing here, and they're adult trees. Whereas a marsh is, if you kind of think of your stereotypical picture of the Everglades, where somebody is driving a airboat through a bunch of grass and water. So that's more of a marsh. It's actually a wetland that's covered with mostly grasses, not a lot of tall or large or woody plants. And then a shrub bog is almost kind of like just in the middle. It's got more shrubby plants. They're like 10 to 15 feet tall, but not actually any large trees. One of the other ways that we can categorize wetlands is by topography, which is the shape of the land. And so one of the most common types of wetlands is a, sorry while I'm talking here, I don't know if you can see it, but there is an alligator out there. He's a small one. I don't think the camera's gonna pick him up, just his eyes are above the water. But anyway, sorry. The categories of wetlands based on topography. One of the most common ones is the basin wetland. And a basin wetland is basically just a low-lying area where water collects. And so any kind of depression or low-lying area is considered a basin wetland. The water will flow down into it and collect. That water could then either stay there, it could percolate down into the ground, it could flow into a different ecosystem. Other types of wetlands that we could have, we could actually have a floodplain, which is the area outside of a riverbank, right? And so during most of the year it's actually dry, but there's a lot of evidence that in the summer months or the wet months or the rainy season months, that river will overflow its banks, and there's evidence of dried moss, dried wetland plants, and water signatures. There's a turtle down there. I don't know if you can see him on the camera, but he is down there. And then the other category of wetland based on topography is a seepage wetland. And that's where you have water flowing into the ground, getting absorbed into the ground at a higher elevation, somewhat traveling underground, and then at a lower elevation, it actually seeps down out of the ground. And so if we think about Florida, Florida is actually kind of like a large seepage wetland in itself. Our aquifer is recharged by runoff in Georgia, Alabama from the Appalachian Mountains. And as that water flows down into Florida's aquifer, the aquifer does travel from north to south. And if you think about the elevation in Florida, the elevation goes from high to low as we go from north to south, until you get down to the Everglades, and the elevation is essentially equal to sea level, and a lot of that water then from the aquifer is actually seeping out of the ground into our Everglades. The other thing I want to point out here, this species along the tree here, this is known as resurrection fern, and as we go higher and higher up the tree, we can actually see some of it's actually dried out here, but if we have look at along here, it looks very much alive. Resurrection fern is actually a neat plant. It will dry out and it will look like it's dead, but once it gets a little bit of water, a little bit of rainfall, it will look like it comes back to life. So we're at station 13. This is another one of the natural depressions here in the wetland. This area, when the other areas dry out, will have usually water in it year-round, no matter how dry it is. And so number 13 is called the Otter Pond. And so if you're lucky, you may see a couple of otters here. I've seen otters here in the past, but one of the places that I more frequently have seen otters is around the area where we had the grandmother tree, right, the old growth cypress tree. I've actually seen otters in that area more frequently than I've seen them here at station 13. Again, as you're walking along through these areas, look down through the water. And pretty sure you could see him on the camera, but there is a large fish right there, because this wetland, again, a lot of this area here will dry up, but these fish will use these ponds as refuges during the dry season, and they will hang out there. So if you notice, we're kind of increasing in elevation here, and we're seeing some more of the more upland species start to appear. And we do have some water down here still, but it's not quite as deep. And so again, everything we walked on today seems relatively flat, but in Florida, just a few inches of elevation will actually make a huge difference. So this is the Popbosch Pond on the trail guide system here, and this one actually has a nice little blind setup where you could sit in here with your camera or your binoculars and just kind of see what comes along. And one of the things I encourage you guys to do is when you're here on this field trip, stop and sit on some of the benches or some of these areas where you can stop and rest and just kind of wait and see what comes along. Right, as I'm moving along and I'm talking, a lot of wildlife is just kind of hearing me and kind of ducking out of the way because they hear me coming. But if you just sit and be quiet, you'll actually see a lot of things in this ecosystem, because this wetland ecosystem is very abundant with plant and animal life. again, here's some more of the lichen growing on the tree here. And so here's a good science joke for you. Did you hear about the fungi and the algae? They took a liking to each other. All right, so now we looped around back to the main entrance trail. So we're gonna just kind of head back out to the parking lot here. So the last thing I want to show everybody today is the map of what we walked through. And so right here, this is 6 Mile Cypress Parkway. This is the parking lot. This is where I parked my car. We looked at some of the pines and the oaks in this area here. And we walked down the boardwalk, and immediately, right, we're in this nice cypress ecosystem. It's actually a very pretty spot here. And then we walked up here. This is the amphitheater. This is where I'm standing right now. So the lake is right over there. And then we walked all the way down here. This is where I told you guys not to lose your sunglasses. Kept on walking. This was the wood duck pond. Kept on walking. And this was the Otter Pond. Walked along here, and then this was the Popbosch Pond here where we had the nice blind. We walked back and we made a left turn, and it brought us back to the amphitheater. So that's what we did today. This is the entire map of the area. And so thanks for coming along with me today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys had a good time.